Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of key national and international issues as well. Today we're going to talk about the issue of food loss and waste and the economic and policy problems which have been causing this and which are in turn caused by this particular issue. Now, the International Day of Awareness of Food Loss and Waste is being observed for the third time on 29th of September with the theme Stop Food Loss and Waste for People and the Planet. Now, this day assumes huge importance due to the rising food insecurity across the globe of late. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, that is UNEP, an estimated 14% of the world's food is lost between harvest and retail. Moreover, another estimated 17% is wasted in retail and at the consumption level as well. Now, this food lost and waste accounts for 8 to 10% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions, that is GHGs. Food loss and waste undermines the sustainability of our food system, thus making them less resilient as well. So what should be done to tackle this particular challenge, both in terms of policy, government-wise and individually, the kind of steps which all of us the citizens of Earth can go ahead and take. For more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with, we're joined by Urmi Goswami here in the studio, senior journalist who's been keeping a close watch on all related issues. Welcome, Urmi, to the studios. Dr. Ruchika Singh is also joining us. She is the Director, Sustainable Landscapes and Restoration with WRI India. And Mr. Alok Sinha, former Chairman and Managing Director of Food Corporation of India, is also with us. Welcome, both of you as well. Urmi, I'll begin with you. And let's start by first understanding, how big is the problem of food loss and waste? That's one. And two, this day, which is being celebrated for the third time in 2019, the United Nations had constituted this particular day. So a bit of a rationale behind that also, and how much of a change, celebrating days like this can bring to problems like these?
So the problem of food loss and waste is huge because it's not just about food loss and waste. It's about a loss of all the resources that go into making food, growing crops and transporting them. So it's a loss of resources as well. So it's a much bigger problem than just the loss of food crops or food. And, when you think about it, I mean, the biggest resource I can think about is water. All that water that goes into growing crops which will never be consumed. Okay. It's a loss of a resource which is anyhow we are going to be dealing with in scarcity of. So that's one part of the story about the magnitude of this problem. And that is why in 2019, when this conversation on observing it as an international day and acceptance at the UNGA came up, because in addressing food loss, you're not just addressing food loss and waste, which also then tackles issues of malnutrition, of inequity of access to food, but also then addresses issues of wasting of material resources, not just water, fertilizer, seeds, time, labor. I mean, the things we don't think of as resource sometimes, right? And so therefore so the focus is then again, as you said, this time is for the people and the planet. Mm-hmm. So if you minimize material waste, not just food, but all that goes into making food, you're also limiting emissions thereof. Like food emissions or emissions from food waste is about what, 8 to 10%?
8 to 10%.
8 to 10%. But that doesn't take into account a lot of the other emissions that we are going to have along the way, mm-hmm. or what happens
of the overall food supply chain,
of the whole entire life cycle of it, right? Mm-hmm. And like what in IPCC terms they'll call scope 3. That means every emission that goes into an input in making this product, which is food in this case.
Okay.
Now, why is it important? What is the benefit of having this kind of a focus at an international level? It gets conversations going. We have seen, a lot of change, at least, conceptually there's been a lot of change. There have been changes in practice of retail chains on how they source food or the kind of food sourcing they do. There's been movements on using what they call waste food, which is basically a vegetable that doesn't conform to a certain shape, size, or form, which is not sold in a supermarket but will get consumed. Earlier, it would have gone straight into the bin.
Okay.
So there are benefits to this. There is a benefit to putting the spotlight on issues, and I think that's important. But the short point that I do want to make is that food loss and waste is not just about the food. It is about every resource that goes into it.
Okay.
Water, time, land, and each one will have its own. It's like tapestry. Each thread will have its own sort of. If you pull, a certain part of the design will come out.
Okay.
So I think that's why this is such a critical problem, and unfortunately does not get the kind of attention it deserves.
Okay, that's what we're trying to do here. In fact, when we're talking about the days like this, this issue is also been dealt with in the SDGs as well. We'll come to that part also. But Dr. Ruchika Singh, I'd like to bring you in here as Urmi was pointing out, this being a very critical problem. In terms of the economic and policy aspect here, what are we looking at vis-a-vis the challenges? Food loss, food waste, accounts for, as I was pointing out earlier, 14% from farm to retail, and then from retail to the consumption level, to the consumer level, another 17%. Now, that's not a small figure at a global level.
Thanks. Very important question. So I'll start with the economic loss. The economic loss, I think, and just building on what the previous speaker said, the economic loss of post-harvest losses, if we just look at, that is quite huge. And this is as per 2014 estimates, which Jha et al. Came out with. It's almost INR 926.51 billion rupees. And if I do have to put this in a perspective, it is, this was about 0.6% of India's GDP and 2.5 times higher than the budget of Ministry of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare at that time. So the economic loss, of course, of food loss and waste is huge. But there is also a lot of, there's a lot of gaps in terms of when we think about policy issues and when we think about research itself on food loss and waste. To give you an example, we did a systematic literature review to look at what really is happening, what is the state of the play, if I may say, on food loss and waste in the Indian context. And few things that kind of, came up. One was there has been mostly focus on quantity of post-harvest loss. And however, when we think about food waste, the data at the retail or household level is much more limited, lesser studies, it's much nascent, and there's a lot more that needs to be done. You mentioned SDG 12.3. We have the SDG 12.3, which is talking about halving the food loss, but also reducing food waste, but also having food loss across production and supply chains. And we need to measure that better. And how do we sort of kind of look at measuring, setting up the SDG targets become important when we talk about reducing food loss and waste. At the, if we just look at a very, very high level in terms of policies, there's been India is one of the few countries which has been systematically looking at estimating food loss since 1968. And ICAR has done a lot of, studies. The last one came out in 2014. So on the measurement, at least on the quantity, there is work that's been done. But there are several government policies and schemes which are focusing on strengthening, for instance, post-harvest management. But the challenge essentially on reducing food loss and waste is that we require action across the entire supply chain. And it's not just post-harvest, but from producer to consumer. How do we think about the entire supply chain and think about specific interventions around that? And this was one thing which the Dalwai committee actually also mentions and validates that, we need to think about interventions beyond cold chain for storing fresh fruits or vegetables, but what really needs to be done from suppliers, plants, machineries across the entire value chain when we can, so it's a bit more. So in terms of policy interventions that may be needed. And how do we also think about, systematically within, who will be the nodal agency, for instance, for reducing food loss and waste, because this is a bit fragmented currently. So, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, okay. We'll come to those aspects as well. In terms of policy also. But first, let's look at the situation in India. Mr. Sinha, I'd like to bring you in here. And when we are looking at the situation in our country vis-a-vis food loss and waste, UNEP report gives the data for 2021 saying that it's around 50 kg per capita per year. Now, global comparison shows that we are doing pretty well. But then, according to your estimates or according to your assessment, how good or how bad is the situation in our country when we're talking about preventing food loss and wastage?
The way I would see it, whether it is of a poor country or a rich country, wastage of food is a very crucial issue, but it is a very awkward issue. I mean, let us just first try to understand, where does the waste take place? Now, it first takes place in the farm gate, and the farmer does not waste it willingly. Then it takes place in the mandis, where the artiya doesn't do it willingly. Then it is bagged and shipped to the shops. I don't think the trader does it willingly, and ultimately the homemaker in the kitchen also doesn't do it willingly. What I think what the problem is, that the way the food grains are collected, packed, processed, and then transported, that is where there is room for much improvement by way of technical input support, which would reduce the losses to a much larger degree than it happens now.
Okay.
Even though the losses in India are not as much as outside India, nonetheless, it is a matter of great concern that so much of food gets wasted. But I would once again like to emphasize, it is not wasted willingly by either the farmer or the artiya at the mandi, or by the trader or by the homemaker. But in the whole food chain, the way it moves and the way it is stored, that is where the problem lies.
Okay.
And there, till now, no cohesive focus has been put on it as to how to reduce it.
Okay.
We
Okay.
talk a lot about it, but I don't think anyone has ever suggested anything cohesive to first ensure that the farmer doesn't waste it as much as it is suspected that it is wasted at the farm gate.
Okay.
Similarly in the mandi, similarly in the retail store, similarly in the kitchen.
Okay, okay. Urmi, that aspect is really interesting and important, as well as Mr. Sinha was pointing out, clearly saying that it's not a willing wastage of food at all these levels, or loss at all these levels. But again, that brings us to the larger question, which was also being pointed out to or referred to by Dr. Singh here, that policy interventions will have to look at it in a more cohesive manner. Just putting in cold chains might not be enough. More infrastructure at various levels, awareness perhaps individually, both at the producer's level and at the consumer's level as well. Is that what it entails?
Well, yes, it entails that and more. One is, of course, Dr. Singh is right. There's more data for at the from farm to market kind of that phase, the post-harvest phase. Maybe what we need is more disaggregate data to realize where exactly the wastage happens most. Therefore, then you can start tailoring the solutions to that. So, is it just handling? Is it that is it storage? I mean, there are all these things, but how much of what? So perhaps more disaggregate data would be helpful for that. But also increasing the options that are available. I mean, we keep talking in terms of cold chain, but that's one option. We keep talking about transport, that's also part of the problem. What about realizing that when you're looking at, say, fruits and vegetables, some of it will not make the journey, no matter how good your cold chain system is. Is there a food processing unit available? Are there options? Can I get the maximum economic value for that vegetable despite it getting, say, injured in the picking process? Are those options created? So that kind of a policy, how do you create that infrastructure? of course, training. You have these agricultural research extension centers. What kind of purpose do they serve? Do they actually help farmers have a better understanding of how best to tackle the food that they produce? B, when we are talking about food waste, sometimes we forget that it's also because of sudden overproduction of certain kinds of foods. So then do we need a better management of what you grow, where you grow? So Dr. Singh is absolutely right. It's not just a simple problem. It's about how you approach the idea of actually reducing waste from every possible angle. And you will see that there are economic opportunities. I mentioned food processing, that's one opportunity. But I'm sure that if you're thinking in terms of training, how best to handle food, what to do with it next, that's a kind of skill development. That's another set of work that comes up.
Okay.
Investing in the agricultural research extension centers, services centers is again another opportunity. So it's not just centered on food. So you have to increase the space in which you operate.
Okay.
And finally, I think what really needs to happen is a better assessment of what you grow, how much you grow, and where you grow it. And I think that is critical. That can help us reduce waste.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Singh, when we are looking at this aspect, as you were pointing out earlier, policy intervention. So, as Urmi was referring to, the kind of policy interventions which are required and a comprehensive approach, as Mr. Sinha was pointing out. And let's not just, only talk about India, because this is a global problem, global phenomena. Every country, be it developing or developed nations, will have to contribute their part here to, bring down the overall effect.
Absolutely. I think this is not a problem which India has. And in fact, in terms of if we look at recognition of the problem also globally, it's only starting, there's more sort of recognition that's starting to happen now. So this definitely is a global issue as well, and requires much more awareness, both at the global level, national level, regional level, locally. None of that can be absolutely denied. In fact, if food loss and just if we look at in terms of the global scope of the problem, one of the things that keeps coming out is if we look at just the emissions, and Ms. Goswami was talking about it earlier in terms of the footprint when we are thinking about emissions, right? In terms of inputs that go into producing food, land, water, fertilizers, etc. If we just look at the emissions globally, if food loss waste was could be the third largest country actually in the world, if we just look at the emissions from that perspective. So it's really an important problem, both globally to look at, but also nationally. In fact, one of the things that sort of we've been also thinking about, and I think the International Day, that's why there is more recognition now that's happening, is globally, I think there's a network that's been developing, because Champions 12.3 or the SDG 12.3 is an important one, as I was saying earlier. So how do we sort of inspire, mobilize action for that? And Champions 12.3 is essentially, it's a coalition of executives from different governments, businesses, international organizations, research institutions, farmer groups, civil society. They're essentially coming together to see how, what really are the strategies that we can think about to inspire, mobilize action, and really progress towards achieving SDG 12.3. So essentially, we need something like that. I mean, learn from what's happening globally, but also because the problem is multidimensional, we also need to think about solutions in the Indian context, which are multidimensional. So when you think about, across the supply chain, and Ms. Goswami was sort of talking about that earlier, there would be some losses, at least could be, mitigated if we are thinking about mechanizing farm operations or value addition that may be needed.
Okay.
And sometimes it's about cold storage. Yes, absolutely, important solution. But also, integrated pest management, or how do we think about, capacity building, packaging. So there's a whole diversity of solutions across different sort of supply chain operations that would be needed when we think about reducing food loss and waste. And I think there's a lot to learn globally, and a lot to create in terms of momentum in the Indian context. And think about food loss and waste separately. I think there's food loss. We still have some data, as I was saying earlier, but on food waste, I think it's a much more nascent area. So how do we create essentially a campaign is what we really need at this. Learning globally, create, and India can actually, take leadership in doing that as well, given we've done some work, but there's a lot more that needs to be done.
Okay. Mr. Sinha, in terms of policy interventions, which we were earlier talking about, the comprehensive approach as well, what would be your suggestions as to what should be done in our country, definitely, and globally as well?
If I can offer a simple solution, I think the root of the problem lies in the uncertainties of marketing. One has heard of stories of when there's a glut in tomatoes or a glut in potatoes, the farmer brings them to the mandi. He sits there for days on end. He's unable to get a good price, or he's unable to sell it at all. So he just chucks it by the wayside and goes away home. Right now, there are stories that lasoon, the output of lasoon is a glut in the Indian market today. It is not selling as much as it is being brought to the mandis. So the problem that arises to a large extent is that an excessive farm output does not lead to an excessive marketing. So when the farmer is unable to sell it off immediately and he is not going to keep it in a cold storage, the cold storage owner also knows that it is not going to fetch him enough returns to put it there forever. I mean, farm output are not like pearls and diamonds and gold biscuits that you can put them in a safe vault and wait for the market prices to go up. You got to sell them in a hurry, if I may put it that way.
Okay.
So unless marketing improves, unless marketing anticipates how much harvesting there's going to be, I think losses will unfortunately continue to happen from season to season, from crop to crop, sometimes of tomatoes, sometimes of potatoes, sometimes of onions. Right now, it is of lasoon.
Okay. So what Mr. Sinha is pointing out there, and that's also important, is that most part of this food loss and waste specifically from the farm produce to the market in a specific sense is to do with the perishable items and the marketing aspect there as well. So that needs to be focused upon. And apart from that, from a global perspective also, Urmi, what is it that in your opinion needs to be done? Perhaps, major economies or developed countries can agree on some sort of policy changes or interventions which become, as Dr. Singh was referring to, good practices learning from each other.
Well, I don't know what they can do collectively, because as you'll realize, at one level, this is such a local problem, right? Now, and a solution like the problem of food loss and waste is a life cycle problem, so is the solution. And, this whole thing about having a glut of production is what we were mentioning. Then what you really need is for farmers to have the ability to sell where they want to, as much as they want to. So you're talking about a life cycle of changes to prevent food waste and loss. What we can learn from each other is how different countries have tackled it. But there's a lot of regulatory change that needs to happen right here. And the other part of the problem is that we keep talking in terms of food loss, which is loss between, farm to market. There is the largely unquantified, at least in the Indian context, waste, which is from market to home and services. And I think that we need to start paying attention to that. We have so far sort of focused only on that because that's been a main part of the problem. But with growing affluence, urbanization, and if you just look around all the garbage that's strewn, you'll realize that food waste is also emerging as a problem. So I think that we need better quantification there.
Better quantification
and
there.
As I said, at G20, at any other forum, is the conversations of what different countries are doing, and maybe there are different problems in different parts of the world, but there are a lot of similarities and we can possibly always learn from them.
Okay, indeed, that is what the idea here is. Thank you so much, Urmi, Mr. Alok Sinha, and Dr. Ruchika Singh as well for sharing your views and insight. As our experts were pointing out, clearly this is a complex issue and a very important one as well, that is food loss and waste, specifically when we're talking about this happening from the farm produce, that is the farm level to the market and from market to the consumer level as well. This poses economic challenges, policy challenges as well. A lot of interventions needed, specific local interventions, reforms in the regulatory procedures as well, and learning from best practices. We'll keep a close watch on this issue and other topics as well. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.